way, and to those of you in the audience that do not appear to be space aliens, I'd like to say good evening. To the rest of you, I come in peace. So John wanted to talk about books.
Books. I mean, this book, the Penguin book of outer space exploration, NASA and the incredible story of human spaceflight, puts together 100+ documents that trace the history of the program. I'm going to read one of them and then let you talk a little bit.
Sure.
This was a fax sent from Moscow to Washington in March of 1993 by the head of the Russian space program. And it says, "We consider a possibility to suggest for your attention a program of International Space Station, which could imply the key project elements of Space Station Mir and Freedom, and would provide for programmatic and economical profit for all participant countries." You think that's worked?
Has it worked? So before I answer your question, which I will, I'll get to in a second, what I just wanted to do here is maybe frame our conversation a little bit and just give you my background on my experience with books. And at first, there wasn't much, actually. You know, I was not a particularly good student growing up. I spent most of my time sitting in the back of the classroom looking out the window or looking at the clock, trying to just will it to run faster. Very atypical for an astronaut. You might think, hey, that guy must have been the smartest kid in the class. That wasn't me. I know I can't see anyone in here because the lights are so bright, but I know there are some kids in here. So if you are listening right now, just put your ears, your hands over your ears, because this is not the preferred path to success. It's really hard to recover from being a bad student. And that was my experience. I did go to college because it's like, what everyone was doing, but I could not pay attention, didn't know how to study, basically failing out of my first year of school. And one day I just happened to go into the bookstore to buy like gum or something. Not a book. I was not a particularly big reader at the time. But I saw a book on the shelf, and not this book, but I'm sure this one would have, especially with that cool cover where you can, a book that got my attention, had a cool cover like this one, a cool title. I looked at it, read it, took my gum money, purchased one of the first books of my life, and went back to my dorm room and read the stories of the fighter pilots that became the test pilots that became the original Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo astronauts. So the book was The Right Stuff by Tom Wolfe. It really spoke to me, and I recognized, I felt like I had things in common with these guys, with one exception, as I couldn't do my homework. But I thought, if I could just fix that one thing, maybe I could fly in the Navy or the Air Force or become a test pilot, maybe even fly in space someday. And I know what you're thinking, 18-year-old kid reads a book, he or she decides to become an astronaut. That's a giant leap. But really, once I figured out the first hard part, it was a bunch of, very much smaller, manageable steps to get there. So that was my experience as a reader, later as a writer. It took me a while to get there. But to answer John's question about the space station and that came out of the Mir program and the shuttle Mir program as a way to get the United States and Russia working together in a collaborative way in something that is very important to both of us in space, common ground. And I think the question John had was it successful? Do you think it has worked as a partnership? I think our space station, our space program, has been an incredible success, especially the international part of it, the international cooperation that we have with Russia and our other international partners. Obviously, with Russia, we're not always the best of friends, certainly not during the Cold War when we're in this Cold War. But we're able to work together in space in a collaborative way. People are sometimes curious, hey, do you guys get along in space? I mean, how how do you deal with potential, conflict that exists on Earth between our countries. On the space station, we are all part of the same team. When you're doing something that is that complicated, technically complicated, challenging, risky, we have to rely on each other to help us with each other's work, for emotional support, for friendship, and in some cases, literally for our lives. So I think the space station has really been an incredible success in allowing nations to work together in a collaborative and cooperative way.
How integrated is it? I get a sense even from reading Endurance that they're kind of two separate stations joined in one place and supplied differently, different food, different operational procedures. How much is separate and how much is operationally integrated?
So some of you may not know a whole lot about the International Space Station, and the first parts of it launched 20 years ago. Maybe this month, last month.
This month?
Yeah, this month. 20 years ago. So the first pieces of the space station are 20 years old. People have been living there for the last 18 years. So, if there are kids in the audience, if you're not an adult, you have never been on the Earth with every single person alive. We've always had people in space. You've not been on this planet with everybody. And the space station is really big. It's 1 million pounds. It would cover the area of a football field. And there are two distinct parts of it. There's a U.S. side that is, the modules are big and they're a little, I would consider them roomy for a spacecraft. They're bright, they're well lit. And then there's a Russian side, but it's a little smaller, a little darker, maybe sometimes a little bit more sinister looking. It's a joke. Make a few jokes at my cosmonaut buddies' expenses, but like I said, they have been fantastic partners. But there are two sections, and it's not like a Berlin Wall between the two of them or anything, but we do have our individual sections of the spacecraft, and the real reason why I might spend most of my time on the U.S. side is that's just where I'm scheduled to work. Doesn't mean the other sections are off limits, but we do often what's called segmented operations, where the U.S. and European and Japanese crew members are doing one thing, and the Russians are doing their own science program. But we share everything. We can share each other's food, and if you run out of supplies. When I was on the space station, we had two cargo vehicles, didn't make it. One Russian vehicle went out of control on launch, and SpaceX didn't make it, blew up. So we would share things, all kinds of different supplies, and whatever we had, we were willing to share with our Russian partners.
You'll have some pictures later, I suppose, of the interior of some of the modules, which look pretty cluttered. I mean, is it a congenial place to be or a hard place to be?
It is a magical place to be, is what I would describe space. There are challenges certainly with living there, no question, when you're living in a confined environment, but it is the most joyous and magical place I could imagine, kind of like a Disney World for adults in some ways. But not an easy place to live. You can't go outside. There's no sun, no rain, no wind. When you go to sleep, you're at work. When you wake up in the morning, you're still at work.
No daylight savings time.
We do have time, which is important. It'd be hard to live without time. We actually operate on Greenwich time because we have all these control centers around the world that support us. And Greenwich Mean Time, which is the time in London or Greenwich, England, was convenient for us because the people that work in the control center in Moscow, most of them get to work via the public transportation system. So the time we use on the space station is based on the Moscow subway schedule, believe it or not.
How much science did you get to do?
I was blinding with science every chance I got. Actually, so our time, that's a joke. Which we would actually say that in the space station. What are you doing when you say that to one of your fellow crew members? The response is, blinding them with science. But you know, our time on the space station is basically in like 3 different categories.
Right.
A third of the time you spent doing science, about a third of the time just taking care of the space station, the overhead it takes to live and work in space. I mean, imagine this giant facility, very, very sophisticated, very expensive, where, you know, if something breaks, you can't call the plumber, the electrician, the IT person.
You're all those things.
You are everything, the doctor, the dentist. So, you know, we spend a lot of time on that third. We spend also a lot of time doing exercise. When we're in space, bad things happen to our physiology. We lose bone mass, muscle mass, effects on our vision, immune system, radiation. But then a third of the time we're spent repairing hardware that breaks. But getting back to the science, in the year I was on the space station, we did 400 different science experiments. Some of them, I was the science experiment, or my fellow crewmates, or even my brother on the ground, my brother Mark, as a control subject. And so you're very familiar with some of the science. Some of the science I may never have heard of. I mean, it's operating on the outside of the space station, or it's something that's controlled remotely from the ground. But yeah, we spend a lot of time doing science, and that's why we have this space station in space, is really the main reason.
Basically, it's just a big research laboratory.
Absolutely, and I think the biggest science experiment of the whole thing is the fact that we've had people living and working in space for the last 18 years. And to demonstrate that we can do that safely. We're learning more about our physiology and how our human body reacts to the environment. Also, how to operate these systems for, you know, a really, really long time. Because, you know, if we're going to Mars someday and the toilet breaks and you can't fix it, you're going to die. You're going to die from a broken toilet. I mean, it's because, you know, you need to. We actually take our on the space station, we take our urine and we turn it into water, which we then drink. Then we turn it into urine again. Then we drink it again. I know what you're thinking.
What's the percentage recovery? How much percent of the liquid gets recovered?
I think we're total liquid on the space station. I think we recover about 70% of it, because you lose some in waste, other forms of waste and food, and there's other ways where the space station loses moisture, but it's about 70% efficient. You know, I know what you're thinking. You know, that guy drank his pee for a whole year. Actually, I drank everyone's pee. It's all mixed together. But it does taste better than the water in Florida.
So do you think the station's ready for another 10 years or so? I mean, the current policy is to withdraw government support 2024, 2025, and try to make it a commercial operation. You have an opinion on that?
You know, the first time I flew to the space station was in 2007 on the space shuttle. I flew 2 flights on the space shuttle. My first was in 1999, a Hubble telescope repair mission. My second was in 2007 to the space station. And with the exception of the space station getting bigger over my 3 times there, it didn't look any older to me, at least the inside. And the hardware overall seems pretty reliable. So, you know, certainly as hardware ages, you know, there's more risk involved. But, you know, that's a risk that is something that has to be evaluated in kind of an engineering and scientific way. My personal experience, based on my, you know, the insight I have, yeah, I think the space station could go another 10 years, assuming we wanted to, you know, put the resources into doing that.
But at some point, I mean, the reason for your mission was to learn things relevant to going to deep space.
Yes.
And at some point, we're going to go.
I hope.
I hope. I think we all hope that everybody in this room. then what happens to the station? I mean,
Well, at
it's
some
a
point-
question nobody wants to really
Yeah.
address. I mean,
Yeah, so, you know, this is a million-pound structure that's flying around in low Earth orbit, and at some point it will have to safely be deorbited back into Earth's atmosphere to, you know, land where most things land from space, which is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It'll be like a controlled entry, and I'm sure a spectacular light show when it comes crashing back into the Earth.
yeah, and people went out to see Mir deorbit in 2001. This will be a bigger show than
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
So,
Hopefully it'll be a while before we do that, but at some point, you know, the space it's inevitable.
and then what? Well, in the years that you've been flying in space, we were going to fly this shuttle until 2020 or beyond. Then we were going to go to the moon. Then we were going to go to Mars. Now we're back to moon on the way to Mars. Where do you come out in destinations?
Well, you know, I think we have an incredible capacity to do very, very complicated, challenging things. You know, I think it's who we are. We demonstrated we could go to the moon in the 1960s. Where we go from here, I don't know. You know, my preference would be to do as much as we possibly could within our means to afford it. But I don't think spaceflight at this point, with you know, the possible destinations we have, is the question of whether we do this or that. It's no longer about the rocket science. It's really about the political science.
Yeah.
You know, it's a policy issue. It's, do we want to spend our limited resources on maybe going back to the moon at the expense of going to Mars, because both will be expensive, or do we just bypass the moon? My opinion would be, if we could only go one place, I think we should go to Mars. But you know, I'm not sure we're willing to make that financial commitment to do that. At least I have not seen that. It seems like over the course of my time in NASA, we're always just you know, 10 years from going to Mars. When I became an astronaut in 1996, we put a little Mars on our class patch, because we were the class that were going to go to Mars. Now I encourage all the classes, don't put that Mars on. Maybe you'll get to go.
Yeah, how do I want to say that? I'm of the generation, the first launch I saw was Apollo 11. Nothing's going to get much better than that in my lifetime. You think we can sustain the interest if we start traveling to deep space again? I think it's been hard to sustain interest when we restricted ourselves to low Earth orbit. It seems to me we have to go somewhere.
Yeah, I think we should go somewhere. You know, I'm not sure I'm the right person to be asking, like, how interested people are in space and how much the public would support something like that, only because, having flown in space a number of times, people always come up to me and seem very, very excited about it. They want to know about it. So my impression is that the American public, you know, the taxpayer who's going to have to foot the bill, is very interested